Welcome everyone to the Person Thing Robot Book Talk. My name is Dan Nguyen. I am a research fellow here at RMIT at the ADM+S Center. We're very excited to be hosting David's World Tour Down Under for this exciting and timely book. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. I will shortly introduce David and his work, and David will talk about his book for about 35 minutes or so. David's presentation will be recorded for those of us who aren't here over the winter break and will be made available on YouTube later. We will go to Q&A after David's presentation, which won't be recorded, and we will do it the old-fashioned way by passing a mic around. After that, we will continue the conversation with refreshments just outside and looking to conclude by around 5 p.m. Right, so now let me introduce Professor David Gunkel, who is an award-winning author, educator, and researcher, specializing in the philosophy of technology with a focus on the moral and legal challenges of artificial intelligence and robots. Professor Gunkel is internationally recognized for his innovative work on the moral and legal status of artificial intelligence and robot rights, his efforts to diversify the theory and practice of AI ethics, and his agenda-setting contributions to the field of human-machine communication. He currently holds the position of Presidential Research, Scholarship, and Artistry Professor in the Department of Communication at Northern Illinois University and Associate Professor of Applied Ethics at Lazarski University in Warsaw, Poland. David is a longtime hero of mine and is a key figure in my decision to pursue an academic career, and so here goes the story. So I first made contact with David as an undergraduate student at RMIT in Vietnam after reading his critique of the digital divide in New Media and Society, which upon checking now was actually published 21 years ago in 2003. And I read it probably 7 or 8 years after it was published. I believe that was my first introduction to deconstruction as a mode of thinking, what David would call thinking otherwise in many of his works. And my little undergrad brain exploded. I realized that I could start challenging binary thinking in all of the subjects that I took at university, even the ones that might not have required such an endeavor. So the most outrageous example of this might have been my insufferable presentation for a class called Client Management in my professional communication degree, where I attempted at deconstructing the binary between client acquisition and client retention. I was so annoying. But engaging with David's works was exactly what 20-year-old me needed. So I needed to be convinced that I, too, have the superpower to engage and rethink all aspects of contemporary life and become sort of an agent of change if I just put my mind to it. So what happened next was I reached out to David through email like the absolute fan that I was, because I had had such an expanding brain experience. And to my pleasant surprise, David wrote me back. I cannot tell you how much of a life-changing experience that was for a young Vietnamese undergrad student doing a communication degree in Vietnam to be corresponding with a professor in America. And I convinced myself that I, too, someday might become a professor. So throughout the years, I would occasionally check in with David about his new works and also for advice on how to navigate academia as someone who would oftentimes feel like an extreme outsider to the inner workings of this mysterious world. And without fail, David would be both the sounding board and the sage who gave great advice and who would put me at ease for not knowing what I'm doing, because we can only make the best out of what we have now and allow our journey to take shape in the face of uncertainty. I think David will tell you that that's actually deconstruction at work, to let life unfold without pretensions to knowing in advance its finality, to actively engage in the now and find ways to always think, speak, and act otherwise. So in other words, if I don't eventually make professor, that's fine. You know, it's all part of the journey. All right, so I want to say a few words about the Machine Question trilogy, of which Person, Thing, Robot is the last installment before I finally let David speak. So the first installment of the trilogy, The Machine Question, Critical Perspectives on AI, Robots, and Ethics, was published in 2012. And it asked the question of machine responsibility towards humans as machines increasingly made decisions that affected human lives. And on the other hand, the question of machine rights. The second installment, which was Robot Rights, was published in 2018, and it was a provocative attempt to think about whether and to what extent robots and other technological artifacts of our own making can and should have any claim to moral and legal standing. The book, in classic Gunkel fashion, argued that we should be thinking beyond the is-ought problem in moral philosophy and instead think about the relational and social context in which robots operate as they become more and more integral in our society. The last installment, Person, Thing, Robots, what we're here today to talk about, is the final piece in this decade-long research program. In this book, David advocates for a hybrid ontology that categorizes robots neither as persons nor things. Moral and legal consideration of robots should not be based on their intrinsic properties, but rather on the relationships and the interactions that they have with us. This relational approach also emphasizes the ethical responsibility that we have towards robots, focusing on how we treat them rather than what they inherently are. I do not know what it's like to write a trilogy. I'm not sure I want to find out. I do know that it's been a pleasure to follow David's work, be it the Machine Question trilogy or the millions of things that he's constantly working on. So it is a real treat to have him here to speak with us today. So without any further ado, David Gunkel.
Okay. So before I begin, I just want to say that it's probably the best introduction I've ever received. So thank you, Dan. And thank you for sharing the story, which I recall fondly. Those email exchanges, and it's really nice to be here again. Dang and I met for the first time in person last year when I was in Melbourne, and so this is the second time we've actually been in the same room together, so it's kind of nice. So I want to talk about the third book in the trilogy. I did not set out to write a trilogy. It happened by accident, I guess you could say. But it's called Person, Thing, Robot, and instead of using words as my title, I'm using the emojis that are used on the cover of the book. So there's person and thing and robot. There's a reason the thing has to be a toaster. We can talk about that during the question and answer afterwards if you like. But if you look at the literature, every time someone mentions thing and they say AI or robot should be a thing, they always add like your toaster. And it just is in every single piece of literature that is written on the subject. All right, so what I have planned is maybe 30 minutes of prepared remarks, and then we'll have time for discussion, question, answer, whatever. So this is the trilogy, just so you can see the covers. So it's Machine Question, which Dang just mentioned, is from 2012, Robot Rights from 2018, and now Person, Thing, Robot from 2023. All right, so let's start talking about ethics. Ethics is actually a very exclusive undertaking. In confronting and dealing with others, whether it be another human person, a non-human animal, the things of the environment, or even an artifact, we make a decision between who is worthy of consideration and respect and what remains a mere thing that can be used and disposed of as we decide and see fit. Now, the question matters because it divides the world of entities into other persons who count versus those mere things that do not. Further complicating matters is the line that divides the thing from the person is neither fixed nor stable. The boundary separating who is a person from what is a thing has been flexible, dynamic, and alterable. Now, this is actually a good thing, as both ethics and law innovate and develop by critically questioning their own limitations and accommodating many previously excluded or marginalized others, recognizing as persons what had previously been considered mere things. So the question that confronts us now at the beginning of the 21st century is what I've called the machine question. That is, can we or should we recognize AI, robots, and other seemingly intelligent artifacts as another socially significant entity with some claim on us, or are they nothing more than a mere thing, an instrument, a tool, or a piece of property? Now, responses to this question tend to pull in two very different and opposite directions. On the one side, those opposing any form of social status for artifacts assert that these technologies are just things or objects that do not possess, excuse me, and will not come to possess the necessary conditions or capabilities to ever be considered something more. On the other side, there are those who favor extending some aspect of social status to AI and robots by arguing that these technologies either have or will soon be able to possess one or more of the necessary and essential properties to be considered something more than a mere thing. Now, what's interesting in this debate is not what makes the one side different from the other. What's actually interesting for me is what both sides agree on and share in common in order to have this conversation and this debate in the first place. And the real problem isn't that this shared philosophical scaffolding has somehow failed in the face of AI, robots, and other artifacts. The problem is that it has worked and worked all too well, exerting its influence and operations almost invisibly and without question. So here's the plan. I want to begin by first identifying and critically examining three seemingly intractable philosophical difficulties with the standard method for deciding these kinds of questions. I call that the properties approach. In response to these demonstrated difficulties, then the second part will introduce and describe an alternative model, one which shifts the emphasis from the internal properties of the individual entity to the extrinsic social circumstances and relationships in which it stands to other entities. Third, then, I want to consider two possible objections to this relational term and respond to these criticisms. And then finally, I want to conclude by explaining how the goal in all of this is not to complicate things, but to introduce and formulate a meta-ethical theory that is more agile in its response to the unique opportunities and the challenges that we face here and now at the beginning of the 21st century. So let's start with the properties approach. In responding to others and doing so responsibly, we typically need to distinguish between what is a thing and who is another person. As Roberto Esposito, who arguably wrote the book on this matter, explains, if there is one assumption that seems to have organized human experience from its very beginnings, it is that of a division between persons and things. No other principle is so deeply rooted in our perception and in our moral conscience. Again, what's important here is not this difference per se, but how this differentiation comes to be decided and justified. In order for something to have anything like moral or legal status, it would need to be recognized as another person and not a mere thing. Now, standard approaches to addressing and resolving these matters typically proceed by following a rather simple decision-making process, or what we could even call a moral status algorithm. In this transaction, we first make a determination as to what property or set of properties are necessary and sufficient for something to have a particular claim to moral recognition and respect. We then investigate whether an entity actually possesses that property or not. And finally, by applying the criteria decided in step 1 to the entity identified in step 2, it becomes possible to objectively determine whether the entity in question can have a claim to moral status or is to be regarded as a mere thing or object. Now, this way of proceeding sounds intuitively correct, and it's rather natural. On this account, questions regarding moral status are firmly anchored in and justified by the essential nature or the being of the entity that is determined to possess them. In this transaction, what something is determines how it ought to be treated. Or to put it in more formalistic philosophical language, ontology precedes and determines social, moral, and even legal status. But there are three problems with this approach. Problems with determination, definition, and detection. And what I want to do is briefly review what these problems are. So first, determination. How does one determine which exact property or set of properties are the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be a moral subject? In other words, which one or ones count? The history of moral philosophy can, in fact, be read as something of an ongoing debate and struggle over this very matter, with different properties vying for attention at different times. And in this process, many properties that at one time seemed both necessary and sufficient have turned out to be either spurious, prejudicial, or both. Second, there's problems with definition. Irrespective of which property or set of properties we select, they each have problems with definition. Take, for example, the property of consciousness, which is often utilized in discussions and debates regarding moral status for intelligent machines and robots. Unfortunately, there is no univocal and widely accepted definition of the term. The problem, as Max Velmans points out, is that the term unfortunately means many different things to many different people, and no universally agreed core meaning exists. In fact, if there's any general agreement among philosophers, psychologists, cognitive scientists, neurobiologists, and AI researchers regarding the property of consciousness, it is that there is little or no agreement when it comes to defining the property of consciousness. Third, there are epistemological difficulties with detection. Most of the properties that are considered morally relevant, like consciousness, sentience, or even the experiencing of pain, are internal mental states or capabilities that are not immediately accessible or directly observable. This epistemological barrier is what philosophers commonly call the problem of other minds, and Paul Churchland describes it this way. How does one determine whether something other than oneself, an alien creature, a sophisticated robot, or a socially active computer, or even another human, is really a thinking, feeling, conscious being, rather than, for example, an unconscious automaton whose behavior arises from something other than genuine mental states? Although philosophers, psychologists, cognitive scientists, and neuroscientists throw an impressive amount of argumentative and experimental effort at this problem, it has so far not been resolvable in any way approaching what was passed for definitive evidence. In other words, no matter what property is identified, it is always possible to seed reasonable doubt concerning its actual presence or absence in the other. Even if the problem of other minds is not the intractable philosophical dilemma that is often advertised, it is sufficient for sowing doubt about the presence or the absence of the qualifying criteria, and by extension, rendering decisions about moral status tentative, indeterminate, and uncertain. Now, perhaps the best example of the problems with this property's way of thinking can be seen with the recent events surrounding former Google engineer Blake Lemoine in the Lambda large language model that was developed by Google. In June of 2022, Lemoine claimed that the Lambda system was conscious and therefore was a person deserving of moral respect and consideration. Lemoine even started to hire lawyers to file on behalf of the algorithm, so it was serious stuff for him. Google obviously shot back and took an opposing position, not only arguing that Lambda, like any computer application, was not conscious, but suspending and then eventually firing Lemoine. Both sides in this debate asserted and sought to justify their positions by mobilizing this properties approach. And each side grappled and struggled with the problems of determination, definition, and detection that we just reviewed. In fact, the entire debate circulated around an inability to resolve these very questions. And if you look at the way that the debate ended up, it isn't like they solved it, right? Google just fired Lemoine and said, "You're wrong, go, you're gone." So this problem is something we see play out all the time when we try to resolve these kinds of questions. All right. So in response to these problems, philosophers, especially in the continental and feminist STS traditions, have advanced other methods for resolving the question of moral status that we can characterize as a relational turn in ethics. Now, this alternative has three pivotal characteristics. And what I want to do again is review these three characteristics so we know what we're talking about. First, in this case, moral status is decided and conferred not on the basis of internal or subjective properties that are determined in advance, but according to objectively observable extrinsic social interactions and relationships. As we encounter and interact with others, whether it be another human person, a non-human animal, or even a seemingly intelligent machine, it is first and foremost experienced in a relationship with us. Consequently, the question of moral status does not depend on what the other is in its essence, but on how it stands in relationship to us and how we decide to respond and take responsibility for the various modes of our responding. In this transaction, relations are actually prior to the things related, or as Karen Berard has argued, the relationship comes first in both temporal sequence and status, and it takes precedence over the individual relata. Now, this change in perspective is not just a theoretical proposal. It has, in fact, been experimentally confirmed in numerous social scientific investigations. The Computers Are Social Actor studies, undertaken by Byron Reeves and Clifford Noss in the mid-1990s, for example, demonstrated that human users will accord computers and other technological artifacts social standing, similar to that of another human person, and that this occurs as a product of the extrinsic social interactions, irrespective of the intrinsic properties of the individual entities involved. And in the research, I don't know if you know the research, but they would survey people who interacted with various technological objects, and the people would say that, you know, they gave them names and they related to them like people, but even though it's a machine, I know it's a machine, I still do this, right? It's almost a fetishistic denial. I know better, yet I do it. And they demonstrated this through numerous empirical investigations. So in their sense, social standing is a mindless operation. And it's mindless in two senses. It doesn't require a resolution of the problem of other minds, and it's something we do automatically without thinking. And these results have recently been verified in what are called robot abuse studies in human-robot interaction research, where researchers have found that human subjects respond emotionally to robots and express empathic concerns for the machine, irrespective of the cognitive properties or inner workings of the device. This research has been going on for about a decade. I don't know if you know it, but if you know it, it's really quite revealing. What the researchers do is kind of a Milgram type experiment. They bring people into the lab, they show them a robot, they get to know the robot, then the researcher gives them a hammer and they say, destroy it. And it turns out people can't. After even short interactions with the robot, they are reticent to harm the social object that they are interacting with. In other researches, like the one done by Astrid Rosenthal van der Putten and her research group in Germany, they actually measured the way the brain lights up when it watches abuse of various things. So this sounds terrible, but they did this. They brought people into the lab, attached them to an fMRI machine, had them watch videos of animal abuse, and then had them watch videos of robot abuse. And it turns out in the brain, no difference. Whether you're watching the abuse of animals or the abuse of robots, the same parts of the brain are activated in the human cognitive system. All right, second, this alternative is phenomenological, or if you prefer, radically empirical in its epistemological commitments. Because moral status is dependent upon extrinsic social circumstances and not the internal properties, the seemingly irreducible problem of other minds is not some fundamental epistemological barrier that must be addressed and resolved prior to moral decision-making. Instead of being derailed by the epistemological problem and the complications of other minds, the relational turn immediately affirms and acknowledges this difficulty as the basic condition of possibility for ethics as such. Consequently, the ethical relationship, as the Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas has written, is not grafted onto an antecedent relationship of cognition. It is a foundation and not a superstructure. It is then more cognitive than cognition itself, and all objectivity must participate in it. Ethics, then, not only transpires prior to and in advance of resolving these epistemological questions, it provides the foundation for addressing and responding to these questions in the first place. This means then that the order of precedence in moral decision-making should probably be reversed. It isn't that internal properties come first and then moral respect follows from this ontological fact. We actually have things backwards. We project the morally relevant properties onto or into those others who we've already decided to treat as being socially and morally significant. In social situations, then, we always and already decide between who counts as morally significant and what does not, and then retroactively justify these by finding the essential properties we believe motivated this decision-making in the first place. Properties, therefore, are not the intrinsic prior conditions for moral status. They are products of extrinsic social interactions with and in the face of others. Finally, making moral status dependent on consciousness or other psychological capabilities belonging to the individual is a thoroughly Cartesian way of thinking. Other cultures, distributed in time and space, do not divide up and make sense of the diversity of being in this arguably binary fashion. They perform decisive cuts separating the who from the what, according to other ways of seeing, valuing, and acting. And we can identify alternative ways of organizing social relationships by considering cosmologies that are not part of the Western philosophical lineage. And what I want to do is read this quote from a indigenous scholar named Archer, his name is Archer Pechuas. But I want to say something about the essay first. Making Kin with Machines is a essay that was written by 5 indigenous scholars from North America, and I think also Hawaii, if I remember. That's part of North America, obviously, but mainly North American indigenous traditions. And so Pechuas is part of the Cree people. The Cree people live in the central part of the United States, around like Nebraska, in that area. But here's how he explains the Cree way of thinking about these things. So the Plains Cree language divides everything into 2 primary categories, animate and inanimate. One is not better than the other. They are merely different states of being. These categories are flexible. Certain toys are inanimate until a child is playing with them, during which time they are animate. A record player is considered animate, while a record, radio, or television set is inanimate. But animate or inanimate, all things have a place in our circle of kinship. Now, this alternative formulation runs counter to the dominant ways of thinking, seeing the boundary between what divides person from thing as being something that is endlessly flexible, permeable, and more of a continuum than an either-or binary exclusive operation. Similar opportunities and challenges are available by way of other non-Western religious and philosophical traditions. In her investigation of the social position of robots in Japan, Jennifer Robinson finds a remarkably different way of organizing the difference between living persons and artificially designed or manufactured things. And she reports this. Inochi, the Japanese word for life, encompasses 3 basic, seemingly contradictory but interarticulated meanings. A power that infuses sentient being from generation to generation, a period between birth and death, and most relevant to robots, the most essential quality of something, whether it's organic or manufactured. Thus, robots are experienced as living things. The important point to remember here is that there is no ontological pressure to make distinctions between organic, inorganic, animate, inanimate, human, non-human forms. On the contrary, all these forms are linked to form a continuous network of being. These alternatives are not the only ones that are available. And by citing these 2 instances, my intention is not to suggest that these different ways of thinking differently are somehow better than those that have been developed in the dominant Western ways of thinking. These alternatives are just different, and in being different, offer the opportunity for critically questioning what is assumed to be true and often goes by without saying. Gesturing in the direction of other ways of thinking and being can have the effect of shaking one's often unquestioned confidence in cultural constructs that are already not natural, universal, or eternally true. All right, so this relational turn introduces alternatives that supply other ways of responding to and taking responsibility for others and other forms of otherness. But it is by no means a panacea, nor is it some kind of moral theory of everything. It just arranges for other kinds of questions and modes of inquiry that are seemingly more attentive to the exigencies of life as it is encountered here and now at the beginning of the 21st century. Having said that, though, it's important to recognize that this relational ethics is not without its own unique set of challenges. And what I want to do is look at 2 common criticisms and supply some responses to those criticisms. So first is relativism. For all its opportunities for thinking otherwise, the relational turn seems to risk exposure to the charge of moral relativism. And there have been a number of recent publications that develop this line of criticism, like the one you see here from Kensuke Musakis from the book Smart Technologies and Fundamental Rights. And Musakis explains it this way. As Simon Kirchen explains, the key relativistic thought is that the something that acts as a standard will be different for different people, and that all such standards are equally authoritative. Particularly problematic is the extreme version, which denies there being any moral judgments or standards that could be objectively true or false. Given the apparent rejection of any such standard by Kuckelberg and Gunkel, they seem hard-pressed to explain how the radically relational ethics they are advocating avoids the extreme version. Now, the perceived problem with relativism, especially the form of relativism that Mousakis talks about here, is that it encourages and supports a situation where it seems anything goes and all things are permitted. But this particular understanding of relative is itself limited and the product of a culturally specific understanding and expectation for ethics. Others, like Robert Scott, understand the word relativism entirely otherwise. He sees it as a positive and not a negative idea. And he explains it this way. Relativism supposedly means a standardless society, or at least a maze of differing standards, and thus a cacophony of disparate and likely selfish interests. Rather than a standardless society, which would be the same as saying no society at all, relativism indicates circumstances in which standards have to be established cooperatively and renewed repeatedly. This means then that one can remain critical of moral relativism in its usual dogmatic sense of the term, while being open and receptive to the fact that moral standards, like many social conventions and legal statutes, are socially constructed formations that are subject to and the subject of difference. Charles S. calls this way of thinking ethical pluralism. Pluralism, he writes, stands as a third possibility, one that is something of a middle ground between absolutism and relativism. Ethical pluralism requires us to think in a both-and sort of way, as it conjoins both shared norms and their diverse interpretations and applications in different cultures, times, and places. Others, like Rosi Braidotti, the feminist philosopher, call upon and mobilize a form of non-Western perspectivism, which exceeds the grasp of Western epistemologies. Anthropologist writes, Eduardo Vivero de Castro, he explains it this way. Perspectivism is not relativism. That's the affirmation of the relativity of truth, but relationalism, through which one can affirm the truth of the relative is the relation. So for Braidotti, perspectivism is not just different from, but she calls it the antidote to relativism. This methodology, as she explains, respects different viewpoints from equally materially embedded and embodied locations that express the degree of power and quality of experience of different subjects. Braidotti, therefore, recognizes that what is called truth is always formulated and operationalized from a particular subject position, and that subject position is dynamic, different, and diverse. The task is not to escape from these differences in order to occupy some fantastic transcendental vantage point, but to learn to take responsibility for these inescapable alterations in perspective and their diverse social, moral, and material consequences. The relational turn, therefore, does not endorse relativism as it is typically defined, but embodies and operationalizes an ethical pluralism, a relationalism, or a perspectivism that complicate the simple binary logic that defines relativism in simple opposition to moral absolutism. The second criticism is a kind of dehumanization. So if moral status is not substantiated by ontological properties, but is the product of external relations with others, doesn't this run the risk, as Anne Gerdes has noted, that we might lose something valuable, that our human-to-human relations might be obscured by our new human-robot relations? In other words, it is possible that what is to be gained for others, including non-human animals, the things of nature, and technological artifacts, could in fact work in the opposite direction and deface another human individual who, for one reason or another, would not achieve the same kind of recognition. This is precisely the concern of Kathleen Richardson, who argues that this relational turn is just as likely to be misused to instrumentalize human subjects. And she explains it this way. If the machine can become another, what does it say for how robotic and AI scientists conceptualize relationship? Is relationship instrumental? Is relationship mutual and reciprocal? What worries Richardson then is that relational ethics, with its focus on social embeddings and externalities, would allow for and justify treating other humans as things and not persons. And in response to this potential hazard, she retreats to a rather dogmatic reassertion of human exceptionalism, which she writes this way: humans are never tools or instruments. Even if relations between people take on a formal character, in every encounter we meet each other as persons, members of a common humanity. A different way to respond to this challenge is to recognize, as the theologian Anne First has suggested, that otherness is not in actual practice at least, unlimited and absolute. And she explains it this way: each of us only assigns personhood to very few people. The ethical stance is always that we have to assign personhood to everyone, but in reality we don't. We don't care about 1 million people dying in China of an earthquake ultimately in an emotional way. We try to, but we really can't because we don't share the same physical space. It might be much more important for us if our dog is sick. Now, this statement is perhaps brutally honest about the way that moral decision-making and the occurrence of otherness actually transpires. Instead of declaring an absolutist claim to some kind of dogmatic totality, it remains open to particular configurations of otherness that is mobile, flexible, and context-dependent. But there remains something here in this formulation that is seemingly abrasive to our moral intuitions. This may be due to the fact that this way of thinking does not make a singular and absolute decision about otherness that stands for all time, such that there is one determination concerning others that persists. The encounter with others, the occurrence of the face in the face of the other, as Levinas would say, is something that happens in time and needs to be negotiated and renegotiated again and again. This would mean then that the work of ethics is ostensibly inexhaustible. It is an ongoing and interminable responsibility, requiring that one respond to and take responsibility for how one responds. Now, is this way of thinking and doing ethics without risk? Not at all. But the risk itself is the site of ethics, and it's the challenge that one must face in all interactions with others, whether human, animal, or otherwise. This way of thinking, then, is not necessarily dehumanizing, but is designed to disrupt and decenter a particular form of anthropocentric privilege that has been characteristic mainly of Western philosophical traditions, taking what had been a hierarchy and leveling it, or at least making it more of an equitable kind of sphere of interactions. All right, so just to conclude this and wrap it up. Ultimately, the question of moral status and the issue of other and otherness that we see with AI and robots is not really about the artifact. It is about us and the limits of who is included in and what comes to be excluded from that first person plural pronoun we. It is about how we decide, together and across differences, to respond to and take responsibility for our shared social reality. It is then in responding to the moral opportunities and the challenges posed by seemingly intelligent and social artifacts that we are called to take responsibility for ourselves, for the world that we live in, and for those others who we encounter here. In devising responses to these challenges, we can obviously deploy the standard properties approach. This method has the weight of history behind it, and it therefore constitutes what we could call the default setting for addressing questions concerning moral and legal status. But this approach, for all its advantages, has demonstrated difficulties with the determination, definition, and detection of the ontological qualifying properties. Now, this doesn't mean that the properties approach is somehow wrong, misguided, or refuted on this account. It just means that this way of thinking, despite its almost unquestioned acceptance within Western philosophical traditions, has limitations, and that these limitations are becoming increasingly evident in the face or in the faceplate of AI, robots, and other artifacts, in the face of others who are and remain otherwise. As an alternative, the relational turn formulates an approach to addressing the question of moral status that is situated and oriented otherwise. This alternative circumvents many of the problems encountered with the properties approach by arranging for an ethics that is relational, phenomenological, and diverse. Whether this alternative ultimately provides a better way to formulate moral decision-making is something that will need to be determined and decided in the face of others and other forms of otherness. Ultimately, the task before us is to learn to question our own sense of exceptionalism. We human beings who have been bestowed with or granted to ourselves the power to decide all things, need to take responsibility for our privilege, for the damage and the harms it has perpetrated across the centuries, and for the myriad of exclusions and marginalizations it has instituted and justified. Now, questioning privilege from the position of privilege is never an easy undertaking, but doing so is necessary, especially if what we want is a moral and a legal framework that is responsive to and responsive for others. So that is what I have. The book, open access. Download it. You can get one today. Don't have to buy anything. No, barrier to entry. So that's the QR code, or you can just go to MIT Press. They have it available there too.